the Observatory. I serve as the chair of the Observatory, and I work as a postdoctoral researcher in DCU Anti-Bullying Centre. As you may know, the Observatory was established last year in 2021, following from the introduction of the Harassment, Harmful Communications and Related Offences Act, which is also known as Caucus Law. The Observatory aims to carry out research on cyberbullying, cyberhate and online harassment, and we aim to host 3 webinars per year. This is our second webinar since the Observatory was established. And if you wish to learn more about the work that the Observatory does, please feel free to consult our website, which is antibullyingcentre.ie/observatory. And you can find also our latest report on gendered experiences of image-based sexual abuse on the website. Today we are joined by 3 guest speakers who will share their knowledge and expertise in relation to the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill and what impact this bill will have on the internet users and the social media companies in Ireland. Before introducing our guest speakers, I would like to inform you that we will have a short, a brief Q&A session at the end of the webinar. The Q&A session will be facilitated by my colleague, Dr. Ioanna Noula. And please make sure to type any questions you might have for the speakers in the chat box, and Ioanna will make sure to share the questions with our guests, speakers. And also, I wanted to let you know that this webinar will be recorded, so feel free to turn off your camera. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Ronan Lupton, who kindly agreed to moderate this webinar. Ronan is a senior counsel practicing in the area of commercial, chancery and media law. Ronan is an adjunct associate professor at the Sutherland School of Law at University College Dublin. He teaches data protection and privacy law. Ronan has acted as an advisor to the government on media-related issues connected to online content, online harms, and the welfare and online safety of children. He has acted on various internet safety boards, including the ISPCC Online Safety Advisory Group, NACOS, and on the board supervising the Hotline.ie service. Thanks again, Ronan, for accepting our invite, and please feel free to start when you're ready. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Angela. That's a great introduction. You've managed to take away my own CV announcements, which is great. I've been in the industry since I finished college in 1998 and worked in telecoms, and then took up practice in the law library in 2008. And Angela has already told you the various roles I've occupied, mostly around the area of child protection online and dealing with very severe harms on the internet. And my practice does indeed connect to media law, but media law is very, very wide. What I don't do really is criminal, in terms of criminal practice and going to the criminal courts for that matter. One other issue I do need to raise is that I am currently a member of Minister Martin's expert group on individual complaint mechanisms. So I will not be in a position to take questions on that area. However, I have decided to put myself open to questions at the end of the session, where Ioanna will take over the moderator role, and I will answer anything that is on people's minds outside of the issue of individual complaints mechanisms and the expert group. And I would just flag to you, by the way, I'm aware that the individual complaints mechanism consultation opened today. So there's a set of questions which many of you on this webinar will be interested to have a look at. And again, I don't make any further comment other than to say that that's available and out there. So I was asked by the Observatory, who I thank gratefully for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all, to spend 10 minutes framing the situation as it was and as it's going to be in relation to how the internet operates in Ireland. Before introducing you to Ioanna Noula, the Director of Research and co-founder of the Internet Commission, and Dualta, Broin, who is the head of Public Policy Ireland with Meta, and they'll be the two main speakers for this particular session. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the environment. So the internet came into being really in the late 70s by virtue of a project called ARPANET. And ARPANET effectively founded what's called TCP/IP, or the underlying addressing for the internet as we know it today. So effectively, the internet came alive in around 1983. The World Wide Web, however, which is how people access the internet or use websites to communicate and post information and content, only really came into being in 1989. From a legal point of view and a regulatory point of view, the law in respect of the internet came into being in the year 2000 with a directive stemming from the European Union called the E-Commerce Directive, a directive which effectively regulates a number of aspects of the internet, or at least seeks to regulate a number of aspects of the internet. Many of you will be sitting there going, well, isn't it the Wild West? Not quite so. And do we not get enough service from platforms when we complain? And, you know, arguably sometimes you don't. But there is a set of regulations which have been in being for 22 years at this stage. In the Irish context, we brought them into being in 2003, so slightly less than that period of time. The regulations themselves under the e-commerce umbrella sit within the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, or Enterprise as we used to know it, or Enterprise and Innovation, or under Leo Varadkar's bailiwick. Whereas the OSMR, which is the current bill that's being debated, or is about to start being debated before the House of the Oireachtas, sits with Catherine Martin, the minister in charge of that particular area. But the current operating model under the e-commerce framework does four key things. It regulates how the pipes or communications between networks operate. It regulates how caching operates. It regulates how hosting should operate. In other words, that hosts such as Facebook and other platforms online have the ability to, I guess, raise a defense. In other words, people communicating between one person and another or posting things online do so exercising freedom of expression and their rights to exercise their freedom of expression rights online. And the content or platform providers may not know what that content is until such time as they're told. We call that the hosting defense. And then the final point, which is of note in respect to the current framework, is a situation which prohibits member states such as Ireland from monitoring content that goes up on a live basis or mandating the monitoring of that content. And that's a very important protection, I guess, in terms of what companies and individuals may or may not want to do online. So effectively, we have what is a flavor of regulation under the e-commerce banner for 22 years, if you take the European emanation of that. Many people complain about different organizations and platforms deploying what they call community standards. We may hear a bit about that later on, or rules within the walled garden of the platform and how they operate, how they do things. But those community standards may not take account of national laws. For example, 27 EU member states have different laws about different things, criminal law, civil law, and so forth. And what the European framework in the year 2000 did was permitted the platforms effectively and the internet to, I guess, flourish and to develop itself without fear of being sued and fear of over-regulation by member states. And those 4 or 5 areas I mentioned to you, hosting, caching, conduit, which is the pipes of the internet, and how organizations communicate between one point and the other, has been very important in terms of the development of the internet and the development of modern communications. I say all of that knowing that there's a war going on at the moment in the Ukraine, and that information and disinformation is very, very important in the context of, for example, something as extreme as what we see on our news screens at the moment, and indeed a cyber war, if you want to put it that, is being fought in respect of how a free internet operates. So up to now, the internet has operated, and I've used the word regulation, but it's relatively light touch in terms of how things have been done, and permissive in terms of how platforms have been able to develop their business. I say platforms in the widest sense. You're talking about banking. I'm not just referring to social media. I'm talking about the widest possible frame of platform that you could take. So 22 years have passed, and the e-commerce directive is now what we might call well into its late stages. In 2019, Ursula von der Leyen, who we all know at this stage, who is the President of the European Commission, brought forward a 100-day plan. And part of her 100-day plan was to reinvigorate regulation around the internet and to put protections in place, or at least draft protections in place concerning how it should operate and behave. And one of the issues she brought forward was a thing called the Digital Services Act. She also brought the Digital Markets Act, which again is another rules of engagement piece of legislation. But the DSA, or Digital Services Act, is a framework which will come forward very shortly, in fact, breakneck speed by virtue of European legislation, to effectively lay out the responsibilities and accountability mechanisms for intermediary service providers or platforms online. The text has three main portions: intermediary liability and the intermediary liability regime, due diligence obligations, and then regulatory oversight. So it's impossible for me to go into any further detail on it, other than just to lay out those kind of high-level facts at this stage. But it is arguably the most important piece of legislation to come through the EU institutions in quite a few years. It'll operate, as I said, alongside the DMA, which is the Digital Markets Act, which lays out almost economic rules for how things will operate on the internet and in terms of online commerce. But arguably, it does rank, DMA ranks before the DSA. So there's been intense lobbying in relation to those pieces of legislation, as you can well imagine. And a recent study showed that 612 companies, in fact, and businesses and associations were involved in lobbying in respect of the DSA on its own. And a huge amount of money has been spent in respect of that. And one figure I saw was that, a total of 271 meetings were held with, lobbyists in respect of, getting their views put across in terms of the DSA and how that would go. So effectively, the DSA is aimed at making digital companies accountable for the illegal and harmful content displayed on their platforms, insofar as it can, while the DMA attempts to establish for the first time a list of do's and don'ts for the biggest online platforms, and so-called gatekeepers. So the Irish solution, and I get to where we're going with the Irish solution now, in the full knowledge that the DSA is coming like a train from Central Europe, the Oireachtas has proceeded to undertake parliamentary scrutiny in respect of the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill, or the OSMR, as we refer to it colloquially. The proposals within the OSMR less frequently replicate, and in many cases duplicate, the substantive provisions of the DSA, particularly along the lines of the online safety aspect of it. And as I mentioned, the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill sits with Catherine Martin, and the e-commerce aspect sits with Leo Varadkar in Enterprise and Employment. So there's two different government departments working on what's going to be the rules in terms of how the internet operates. So the proposals are interesting, to say the least, because of what may need to change if we bring forward our national legislation, and suddenly there's a piece of European legislation sitting there that needs to be transposed. There's the implementation timelines, I guess, for both pieces of legislation are very similar. When you think about the 5 stages of where the OSMR must go through the Oireachtas versus what stage the DSA is at. The DSA is at late stages in the European context at this stage. So the requirement for unpicking the OSMR, if it gets passed and when it gets passed, will be interesting to see, because the DSA will make changes to what effectively will be in national law, I think, at that stage. So looking very briefly, and to keep this as short as I can, at the OSMR. The OSMR is the Online Social Media Regulation Bill. It effectively does two things. The first job of it is to bring forward the Audiovisual Media Services Directive 2, which is a piece of European legislation that we're late transposing. And the second part of it is to bring in rules for online safety or online engagement. And I'll just cover the online safety aspects of it very, very quickly. The first chapter of the online safety proposals looks at harmful online content. Now, we haven't spent 2 years trying to define what online harm is, but there are some definitions within that legislation, which I think are interesting and should be looked at by many on this particular webinar. It gives the regulatory bodies which will come forward as a result of the proposals the power to specify harmful online content. It puts in place procedures and proposals for orders in that regard, and then it also deals with age-inappropriate content. Chapter 2 gives powers to the regulator to designate online platforms or online services and to require information from those designated services, and also video sharing platforms in terms of their designations. It sets out the procedure for designation, it sets out how designation can be revoked, and then it sets out proposals in terms of a register for designations. Chapter 3 is very interesting as well. It talks about the issue of online safety codes, and there's a lot of detail in the legislation in that regard. And it's something, again, that I think the vast majority of people on this webinar will be interested in terms of how the future will look. It talks about the application of those online safety codes, various matters that regulators need to consider when dealing with online safety codes the procedure for them, and then compliance in respect of online safety codes and information notices. Audits of complaints and complaint handling for platforms, and that's a huge issue if they are designated subject to safety codes. That's not something that featured, obviously, in the recent past, other than companies giving self-reports or self-regulatory information out as a result, and then enforcement of online safety codes. Chapter 5 deals with the whole issue of guidance materials and advisory notices. Not a whole lot to be said about that. Chapter 4 again. Chapter 5 deals with the scheme for notifications by nominated bodies, and the duty of the Commission to encourage the use of mediation, voluntary arrangements, and in respect of providers in other countries or third countries which are outside the European Union. And then the stinger for me under that particular chapter is e-commerce compliance strategy. So effectively what we're looking at is a piece of legislation which says I'm going to comply with the old 22-year-old law on e-commerce and how that should behave. And meanwhile, we're doing this in the full knowledge that there's a DSA coming down the tracks really quickly at us. So we're going to comply with the old law at this point. So there will be an unpicking to do. And I have given this evidence, by the way, in terms of my views before the Oireachtas, even though perhaps the legislation was at that stage, we needed to move on from that. But importantly, thereafter, in that particular chapter, a very long list of harmful online content and specific offences is listed. So for many of you, again, I just draw your attention to that in terms of what's codified or what's expected to be codified in law in terms of the offences that come up, and some of them are pretty extreme and important. Notably also for many of the lawyers and policy people on the webinar, and I'm going to cut it short at that stage and go to the first speaker, investigations and sanctions are very new in terms of the Irish position. And my comment, and again, I think people share this view, is it looks very similar to the GDPR in terms of how investigations and sanctions will be brought forward. So investigations and sanctions are catered for authorised officers and nominated people in terms of investigations, search warrants, and how decisions of the Commission will work. Interestingly then, for the businesses in question and subject to these particular reviews, administrative financial sanctions are built in and catered for, and then appeals and how courts would approve things. And then very interestingly, I think from a media lawyer and a practice point of view is powers, corrective powers as they call them under the data protection regime, but powers that regulators might yield in terms of the future of misbehaviour online. So notices to end contravention of particular directions and orders, access blocking orders, content limitation notices, and appeals. So I don't want to say much more because I know I'm kind of close to my time in terms of the speaking allowance that I had, but suffice to say that we're in a very interesting legislative position at this point, where Europe will eventually trump what goes on in Ireland. Ireland will, by virtue of the separate ministry that's going to have to look at the DSA, have a job of work to do in terms of also the job of work that's going on relating to the OSMR in the purest of senses. So there's a big, I guess, clash of legislative priorities and interests. And meanwhile, you're all sitting on the internet there looking at me going, what about the children? What about the people who are subject to both offline and online behaviours which are harmful, and are we doing enough? So self-regulatory models appear to be going out the window to more regulatory models. And the question is how those rules will operate and what the engagements will be into the future and in the future. So I hope I have managed to tee up what is one silo of what the current operation position is, or the current law, what the Irish position is under the OSMR in terms of the new law, and the DSA in terms of what Europe thinks the way things should operate will be. And of course, what Europe thinks is what the law will be, because it will be superior and directly applicable and effective as soon as it's agreed, and we'll have a transposition period. So I'll stop at that. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought in terms of questions afterwards. And as I said, I will open myself up for questions on everything bar individual complaints mechanisms afterwards, and Tiana will take over for moderating. So I think I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, if that's possible. And I think it's Ioanna Noula. Am I right about that in terms of sequencing? So I'll hand over to you, Ioanna, and look forward to speaking to you at the end of the session.
Thank you very much, Ronan. This was indeed very rich and thought-provoking, and I kept on keeping notes and hope I haven't, I will not overwhelm you with responses and information. Just very briefly about me and the Internet Commission. I am the co-founder of this non-profit organization that aims to advance digital responsibility through by providing mechanisms for independent evaluation. The Internet Commission was born in the context of conversations and activity that myself and the co-founder of the Internet Commission, Johnny Shipp, had as visiting fellows at the School of Economics. And we identified many conversations, myself as an academic, Johnny as someone coming from a corporate background in the telco industry. We identified that many conversations about the same topics happen in silos, and we have very limited, at the time in 2017, very few opportunities for multi-stakeholder engagement on the important issues that have to do with digital policy. So I should be sharing my screen here. So as I said, today I will be speaking about the Internet Commission and our work on content moderation, with focus on issues of online safety and the importance we attribute to procedural accountability of online intermediaries. To speak about this, I will draw on the work we've been doing over the past 3 years, producing 2 accountability reports, working with different kinds of digital organizations, aiming to mitigate the impact, the negative impact that content moderation or limited content moderation may have on society. So we departed from the idea, from the argument that digital transformation has been taking place relatively in an unchecked way. And that is because often the technologies that emerge are largely black boxed and difficult to understand and make sense of or predict their impact. The backlash that we have been faced with over the past decade, including issues that have to do with privacy, with integrity of elections, the info wars online, and so on. This backlash has resulted to a trust crisis. Important informed and expert stakeholders produce a lot of criticism, produce a lot of evidence that shakes the public's trust in the quality of services or the ability of big digital organizations, intermediaries, to take charge and live up to the task of creating a healthy public sphere online. We argue that this results inevitably, this public outrage results to what we call regulation by outrage. And that has to do with the fact that policymakers are often not sufficiently informed at the same time that they try to respond to the public demand for rectifying and addressing the issues. And therefore, the regulation can indeed be stifling beyond what is perceived as stifling regulation. It can be impertinent and therefore very much impeding useful innovation. So our aim is moving from what we call this vicious circle of digital transformation towards delivering a positive cycle that starts with the independent evaluation of internet companies and online service providers and understanding what is happening in those black boxes, helping therefore policymakers and regulators understand the black box as well as practices as well as their impact, and deliver smarter and more agile regulation, and therefore deliver a more responsible and sustainable digitalization. So how do we do this? The main idea is that transparency reporting, self-reporting, and self-regulation haven't quite worked, haven't delivered. We see regular transparency reports from big platforms that do not necessarily provide orientation or sufficient information as to what is happening online, how and why they do things. This is exactly why we thought that someone has to intervene to make sense of what is happening, and focus mostly on the how and why things are happening, by looking at the integrity of procedures and how decisions are being made. So in that sense, by taking a closer look on these processes, we are able to understand as well the business ethos, the business culture that shapes services. And we find that this is the most economical and sustainable approach to regulation, coming closely, understanding what goes wrong on a more on a values related level, and therefore rectifying and addressing the root causes of the problems. With that said, we welcomed the DSA's focus on accountability, the fact that they set, the European Commission sets clear responsibility and accountability for providers of intermediary services. At this time, there is a focus clearly on online platforms, social media, and marketplaces. There are a number of weaknesses and from our perspective, limitations. However, it sets a very good, it paves the road, I would say, towards a better attitude and a more balanced relationship between the public, the user, and the platform on the other hand. So an important contribution that also aligns with our mission and what we have set out to do is the requirement that there is for very large online platforms to manage systemic risk, and importantly, to submit themselves to external and independent audits. What we have tried to do, and I wouldn't expect you to look closely at this mapping over here, but what we have tried to do is to operationalize the concept of digital responsibility, understand what a responsible organization looks like, what are the parameters that should be addressed, the issues that should be addressed. And against the backdrop of absence of evidence or precedent and so on, we try to imagine what good looks like. And therefore, we took a more values-driven model that is aligned with sustainable development goals, around which nations around the world align. So we used again, against the absence of evidence and against the absence of benchmarks, we turned to a flexible model that will enable us to assess how advanced companies are and how mature their operations are. And we turn to the business literature and definition of responsible businesses, and try to translate all these requirements into the needs and priorities of the digital ecosystem. This is a kind of ranking, if you will, that we have been using in order to map the maturity of online platforms in terms of their responsibility, their ownership of the impact that they have. And here we have one axis, that the strategic approach to this, and on the other hand, there is the organizational model as well, as to why things happen the way they do. Again, I don't want to go into the details of this. There are these from the least mature towards the most mature stages of business practice. What makes all the difference is how much engaged a company is with the impact that it has, or even if it is in denial, or if it merely does the bare minimum to comply, or if consciously and in a strategic way seeks to make a difference and mitigate the harm on society. Over the past 3 years, 2 years, we have worked with a number of organizations who signed up to our process and submit themselves to our evaluation. That includes the BBC, 2 dating apps, Meetic and Tinder, a children's social media platform, Popjam, Sony PlayStation, and Twitch, most of which you're familiar with. In 2021, last February, we published our first accountability report on online content, contact, and conduct. And we were able to deliver, to create a first evidence base on how companies moderate content online. We developed, after conducting international and stakeholder and across stakeholders consultation, we developed our first evaluation framework, which was based, it departed from the 2018 Santa Clara Principles on Transparency Reporting, which companies usually use to produce their transparency reports. And we built on that, adding primarily our not so secret anymore ingredient of looking into governance issues. How, as I said earlier, how decisions are being made and what resources are being used in order to have the certain outcomes that companies usually share publicly. We try to address the usual tensions, how safety and security are balanced with freedom of expression and privacy. We try to reflect the growing importance of automation, including machine learning and artificial intelligence. We are independent of government and industry. And we try to take a more international perspective and again address the tension between the local, the context-bound and the international character of these services. And finally, in order to do this, we use both qualitative as well as quantitative indicators. Again, this is something that differentiates our report from the typical transparency reports in the sense that we move away from numbers towards understanding the process and the why and how of the process. Our first report identified 8 key challenges across a number of findings that we are sharing. I want to stick to the numbers, although numbers do not necessarily do justice. And the reason I decided to go with the numbers-led approach is because numbers show that we produce or communicate production and evidence, and also they form better takeaways. So our analysis of the evidence in 2020 produced 2 sets of knowledge. One had to do with the cultural dimension of what is happening in a company or how the content moderation happens. And the other one had to do with a procedural dimension, as you can see in the bottom. The cultural dimension encompasses the corporate purpose and style. as well as the relationships with people, knowledge, how knowledge is being embedded, and how skills are being taken advantage of. Within this, the challenges within this cultural dimension, the challenges that we have identified and resonate, I would say, with what is being discussed right now on the bill, had to do with the right of appeal, users' rights of appeal, clear routes to redress, the safety by design, and the ability of platforms to address moderator welfare. Although we have identified great practices in all these areas, at the same time, we understood that these are the key areas where most of the platforms find it difficult to address. In terms of the procedural dimension and in relation to user engagement, reporting and customer focus have been two of the key themes that present challenges, that reflect the relevant challenges. And there's the process innovation and automation related challenges that have to do with age assurance technologies, the moderation, and understanding, most importantly, understanding emerging issues, which I guess is the most important challenge for policymakers as well. Moving on to 2021, we just finished our second accountability report, which is due to be published on the 10th of March. And I welcome you to visit our website and order your copy. So this is hot off the press, and we have, the report is based on an evolved and updated evaluation framework, because as you may understand, the business that we're in, the digital business, the automation business requires adaptability and requires following closely how things are happening and what the new gaps are. So therefore, our second evaluation framework builds on the previous one, draws on lessons from the first accountability report, aligns with key international digital policy frameworks that emerged over the past 1 year, takes a European and international perspective. Again, we remained independent of government and industry, and we have tried to incorporate as much feedback as possible from researchers, regulators, and participating organizations. There are three themes that emerged after following our analysis. The first one has to do with user agency, and we have seen that the most mature companies, if you will, are the ones who engage users in the strategic shaping of policy. There's also the theme of proactive oversight, the companies that, again, in a more conscious way, take responsibility, recognize their impact, and take responsibility for this. And finally, the theme of innovation and the fact that more mature companies use new technologies to support both safety and freedom of online. So going back to the first theme of user agency, we have seen that those more mature organizations systematically incorporate user voice, they monitor user needs, and engage in a systematic way with policymakers. In terms of the proactive oversight, maturity means that the higher level, the leadership of organization is involved in the process, and they're also proactively involved in policy debate and the standards development. So in terms of the ways forward, I think we always need to reiterate the fragility and global strategic priorities for the democratization of the public sphere and safeguarding of user rights. We understand that advancing user participation and bottom-up service design is very important in terms of preempting harms and understanding in a timely manner the needs of the users. And in this regard, it is of significant importance, the complaints routes, the attention to complaints routes, as well as the development of user-friendly reporting tools. It is also important to consider for companies, for organizations like ours, auditors, to consider the developments in the policy landscape that account for users' digital rights. We reckon that there is merit in developing industry-specific standards for compliance. As you have seen, we have worked with a very diverse cohort of organizations, including a news organization, dating apps, children's social media, and so on. And it's important to therefore pay attention to their needs, as well as their capacity. And finally, we cannot state enough the importance of independent audits to do that. The questions that emerged, though, from this last point, as well as from DSA's Article 28, is what does an independent auditor look like? This is something that many policymakers, legislators talk about, but there isn't sufficient discussion even about the character of this auditor. If this auditor, if we have this auditor, how can we ensure the independence of such entity? Our exercise, our work over the past 3 years has shown that it is a difficult task to undertake, but it's also doable. If sufficient thinking and sufficient care goes into the matter, independence is achievable. And finally, we ask how the EU can accredit, but also empower the auditor. And with that, I will close and thank everyone very much for their attention.
Thanks very much, Ioanna. That was really excellent. There was some brilliant points covered in relation to, firstly, the regulatory aspects of I guess, knee-jerking, which does happen from time to time, and regulation by outrage, and making sure we don't go down that road. And the analysis in the slide deck is fantastic. It's something actually which I hope I'll be able to get my hands on after the meeting, because certainly the reporting and some of the graphics really show the depth of thinking and depth of knowledge and engagement in terms of your work. So thank you so much for taking the time to run through that as quickly as you did, and as well as you did. So I'll hand over now to Dualta Broin, who you know is the head of public policy for Ireland at Meta. So Dualta, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Ronan. Can I just check that you can hear me? Good. My name is Dualta, and I'm Meta's head of public policy in Ireland. Prior to taking up this role in 2019, I was a civil servant, most recently working in the broadcasting and media division of the then Department of Communications. I worked on a range of online safety related issues as part of that role, including the negotiations of the revisions to the Audiovisual Media Services Directive and the Action Plan for Online Safety. I'd like to thank Angela and the rest of the team for inviting me to speak this afternoon to share Meta's perspective on online safety regulation in Ireland. And I'd also like to thank Ioanna for her extremely interesting presentation. And I think it chimes with something that I'm going to touch on later in my contribution around the development of standards and what does good look like in this space. I do have to start by giving significant recognition to our hosts, DCU's National Anti-Bullying Centre. Last year, they marked 25 years of research on bullying and cyberbullying, While 1996 was not quite ARPANET, I would find it difficult to describe what tech looked like at that time to anyone under the age of 30. I think it is interesting to note that 1996 is the year that the World Wide Web overtook Minitel as the world's leading online network. So that's how long DCU's Anti-Bullying Centre has been around. We are incredibly proud to have been supporting the Centre's Fuse programme since 2019, and I'm very pleased to say that we will support its work for a further year. I'd like to congratulate James, Darren and the rest of the team for their work, and I'd also like to thank Pat Edmondson and DCU's Educational Trust for their partnership in this project. Every time I speak to the Fuse team, I'm struck by their passion for building a programme that will make a difference at a societal level. I also believe that Fuse has the potential to be the template for how school communities across the world address these issues. We are only beginning to scratch the surface of what that programme can achieve, and we were especially pleased to see the addition of 2 hate speech modules to the programme last year. For anyone who isn't familiar with the programme, especially any post-primary school that hasn't signed up, I'd encourage you to check it out. There are plenty of mind-blowing stats that the team can provide, but for me, the top 3 are that Fuse is now available in 56% of post-primary schools in Ireland. On having completed the course, almost 90% of participants said that they are more confident in knowing how to use social media safely, and 90% say they are more confident in knowing how to respect others online. As somebody who was bullied as a child and who witnessed other children being bullied and did nothing, I'm still dealing with some of the effects of that today. I hope that the tools that children, teachers, parents, and the wider school communities are learning through the programme mean that less children suffer from the lifelong effects that bullying can cause. As a son of 2 teachers, I'm sensitive to the way in which the phrase education can be casually stated as the solution to all of society's ills, and the pressures that causes for the education system, schools, and individual teachers. I've witnessed my parents come home from enough parent-teacher meetings and listened as they vented their frustrations to know the unrealistic expectations that some parents can have, that the teacher or school should solve everything. And that is one of the great strengths of the Fuse programme, that it addresses the issue with each stakeholder within the school community and empowers each of those, whether it is children, teachers, parents, or boards of management, with the tools that are needed to ensure that as few children as possible suffer from bullying, and anyone within the school community that witnesses somebody else being bullied knows exactly what to do. One of the most important structures that I think about whenever I discuss online harms is the hierarchy of responses recommended by the Law Reform Commission in its 2016 report on harmful communications and digital safety. This was building on a similar 3-tiered hierarchy which had been developed by the New Zealand Law Reform Commission in 2013. In my mind, it makes sense to think about this hierarchy of responses as an equilateral, I beg your pardon, triangle. And I've adapted the LRC's description slightly to reflect the approach in the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill. Right at the very peak of the triangle is an extremely small section which represents content that is illegal and should be subject to the harshest penalties and criminal sanctions. There is a global consensus that terrorist and child sexual abuse content falls into that category, for example. Then below that, there's a second section which contains content which is not illegal, but where there is a common consensus that the content is harmful and action should be taken. This is the content which doesn't qualify for the involvement of criminal law, but where education around bullying and digital well-being has proven ineffective. This section is where the OSMR bill proposes that its category of content should sit: serious cyberbullying, content that promotes eating disorders, content that promotes suicide or self-injury, or demonstrate methods of suicide and self-injury, in addition to content which is inappropriate for children. Below these 2 sections sits the base of the triangle, and within it sits a whole range of potentially harmful content which do not qualify for the involvement of law enforcement or regulatory intervention, such as hurtful comments between young people. The LRC report recommends that the most effective societal response to this range of harms is through education to create user empowerment and foster safe and positive digital citizenship. While I am sometimes criticised when I raise this point, I think it is very important for us to keep this in mind as various aspects of EU and Irish content legislation are finalised in the months and years ahead. When the regulatory and legislative interventions have been finalised to deal with the first 2 sections of the triangle, There will still be a broad category of online harms where the most effective societal response will be via educational initiatives. Regulatory interventions which bring about improvements across the industry will, to a certain extent, reduce the prevalence of certain types of content, but reducing prevalence on its own will not solve these issues. This is why we were pleased to see Minister Norma Foley announce the establishment of a steering committee which will review the existing action plan on bullying and develop a new action plan. This is an example of the type of action that is required outside of regulation of online platforms to address online harms. Some of you at this point might be thinking, hang on a minute, who does this guy think he is, telling us that education is the answer? What about his company's responsibilities? I'm not saying that education is the only solution. I'm saying that education is a fundamental part of the solution, just as law enforcement are in dealing with the most serious offences, just as the regulator will be in overseeing the systems we have in place to keep our users as safe as possible, just as researchers and academics are in increasing our knowledge and developing new ways of thinking that will be required to deal with these issues into the future. I view the role that industry and Meta will play as central to the entire process. We are present and have responsibilities at each level of the triangle I have described, whether that is cooperating with requests from law enforcement at the very top, to supporting programs such as Fuse to bring about broader societal change. We will never back away from our responsibilities in these matters, but without everyone doing their part, we will not achieve our desired outcome of an online world where harms are minimized. This is the multi-stakeholder approach, and I'm glad that Ioanna also mentioned it earlier. The phrase has gone into hiding a bit in the last few years, perhaps similar to education, it had been overused. There was broad agreement a decade ago that the only way to resolve online harms effectively is via a multi-stakeholder approach. And I think most stakeholders, once they have considered the role that each of us can and do play, would agree with that statement today as well. I sincerely hope that we don't lose sight of this the closer we get to the establishment of regulators, because regulation on its own or actions by Meta alone will not be sufficient to address all online harms. So why is regulation important to Meta? I think a useful starting point for discussing our perspective on regulation is our CEO's opinion piece in March 2019. In it, he called for greater regulation in 4 key areas: harmful content, political advertising, privacy, and data portability. What is perhaps notable from an Irish point of view is that it was 4 weeks earlier that then Minister Richard Bruton announced his intention to bring forward online safety legislation. At the time, we welcomed Minister Bruton's intention, as he stated it, of achieving a proportionate and effective approach to harmful online content. At the time, many people asked why the company was calling for greater regulation of harmful content. The reasoning is pretty simple. For centuries, societies have wrestled with the question of how and when governments should place limits on freedom of expression to protect people from content that can contribute to harm. Increasingly, privately run internet platforms are making these determinations as more speech flows through their systems. Consistent with human rights norms, internet platforms generally respect the laws of the countries in which they operate. And they are also free to establish their own rules about permissible expression, which I think Ronan touched on earlier, which are often more restrictive than laws. As a result, internet companies make calls every day that influence who has the ability to speak and what kind of content can be shared on their platforms. Problems arise when people do not understand the decisions that are being made or feel powerless when those decisions impact their own speech, behavior, or experience. Platforms are facing increasing questions about how accountable and responsible they are for the decisions they make. They hear from users who want the companies to reduce abuse but not infringe upon freedom of expression. They hear from governments who want companies to remove not only illegal content, but also legal content that may contribute to harm, but make sure they are not biased in their adoption or application of rules. As our CEO stated at the time, regulation can set baselines for what's prohibited and require companies to build systems for keeping harmful content to a minimum. We are not standing still, waiting for regulation and regulators. It has always been in our interest to remove harmful content and to keep our users as safe as possible. People don't want to see harmful or illegal content when they use our apps, and advertisers certainly don't want their ads next to that type of content. We spent approximately $5 billion on safety in 2021, and we now have more than 40,000 people working around the globe to keep people as safe as possible. We continue to invest in new products and tools which allow users to better protect themselves. I'll go through a few of them here. We have prioritized safety and well-being of the features for younger users. Most recently, we launched Take a Break on Instagram to empower people to make informed decisions about how they're spending their time. If someone has been scrolling for a certain amount of time, we'll ask them to take a break from Instagram and suggest that they set reminders to take more breaks in future. We'll also show them expert-backed tips to help them reflect and reset. To make sure that teens are aware of this feature, we show them notifications suggesting they turn on these reminders. We've given people more control and the ability to filter offensive comments and messages. Instagram's hidden words feature allows people to select a predefined list or create their own list of potentially offensive words, phrases, and emojis, and hide any comments that uses these terms. Hidden words also works in direct messages, automatically sending message requests containing these terms to a hidden folder, so the Instagram user never has to see them. And I suppose of particular relevance to the centre's discussion, we've also recently introduced a safety feature called Restrict, which is designed to empower a user to quietly protect their account without letting the bully know. By restricting an account, the bully's comments on your post will only be visible to them and no one else, unless you approve them, and they won't be able to see when you're active on Instagram or when you've read their messages. So those are just some of the examples of tools, and we are constantly seeking to develop new tools, which will, as I said, keep our users as safe as possible on our services. Just to come back to the establishment of standards, standards features quite heavily in the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill, and this is very positive from our perspective. As I mentioned earlier, the development by government of standards or baselines is one of the things that we identified as being critical to moving the conversation on content regulation forward. In addition, we think internet companies like Meta should have our content moderation processes subject to requirements around transparency and independent auditing and oversight. We've already made significant progress on transparency. We have published extensive data through the Community Standards Enforcement Report. You can look up how much content is removed, how much we detect proactively, and even how much harmful content people see on our services. This allows us to see the progress we've made, where we have more work to do, and holds us publicly accountable for doing so. We're also subjecting that transparency report to an independent audit, the results of which will be published to ensure the accuracy of the numbers we report. When it comes to auditing the overall approach to content moderation, there's still a lot of work to do. We believe that it's time to move beyond raising questions and highlighting concerns, and it's time to get specific about what the standards for content moderation should be, and to get specific about how to audit compliance with those best practices. This is the work which the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership is doing, and we're very pleased to be involved in it. The partnership has brought together internet platforms to agree on high-level best practices for content moderation and set out a framework by which companies can be assessed. It's been consulting to add more detail and specifically how to tailor depending on the size and nature of the services, which I know is a point that Ioanna stressed earlier. And just to give people an idea of what's involved with the GTSP, companies sign up to five responsibilities. They're product design and development. The second one is product governance, enforcement, quality assurance, and product improvement and transparency. So you can see that that maps onto quite a bit of what Ioanna was talking about in her presentation as well. The partnership is currently working through how an audit and oversight mechanism should actually function. These are very complicated issues where every detail is going to matter. The member companies are in the process of undergoing a self-assessment audit this year against the DTSP framework, the results of which will be published in early summer. Next year, the members will be subject to an independent audit. We hope that a system such as this will become a global industry standard in the next couple of years. Standards-based and evidence-based processes are what we need to know how companies are doing on content moderation issues. That is how we will know whether companies are doing an effective job, and that is how companies will be held accountable. It will also help regulators globally. Using an international standard will help cooperation between regulators and ensure regulators can focus resources on the issues that are most important nationally. The new regulator, when appointed in Ireland, might decide that they want to take a different approach towards setting standards. However, we believe that the work being carried out by the partnership will provide a strong foundation for regulators to build upon as they seek to understand and measure our performance. And we're pleased to see that organisations like the Internet Commission are also adding to our shared knowledge in this area. So at this point, I'll share some of our views on the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill. We submitted quite a detailed position to the Oireachtas Committee as part of the pre-legislative scrutiny last March. I think it ran to 65 pages, which is available on the committee's site if people are really interested in getting into the detail. But I suppose a couple of high-level points. The first, and Ronan has set out a number of the evolving legislative pieces that are moving at the moment. And that's the first point I'd make. It is not happening in isolation. At the EU level, we're expecting the Commission to publish its child sexual abuse proposal at the end of March. The terrorist content regulation must be implemented by Ireland on the 7th of June. And we expect that the DSA will be finalised probably September, October. At the national level, the government is committed to publishing its hate speech and hate crime legislation this year. We may also see an electoral reform bill at some point. And we're also expected to see a report on the review of the defamation legislation at some point this year. We understand that the Department of Enterprise is carrying out a regulatory impact analysis to inform where the functions of the DSA's Digital Services Coordinator should live, for example, as part of the Media Commission, or a new regulatory body, or a combination of regulatory bodies. What that department has also said is that legislation will be required to give effect to the DSA in Ireland. Even if it appears particularly busy at the moment, I think most people who are working and monitoring this space expect that content legislation will continue to evolve for at least the next decade. I think what is most important at this point in Ireland is that an appropriately resourced regulator is established as rapidly as possible. There is a need for this, given the implementation of the revised AVMSD is likely to pass the 3rd anniversary of the deadline for implementation in September. Given my personal relationship with this particular law, it is understandable if I'm more than a little bit biased towards it. But I think sometimes people can gloss over it in conversations, and it's worth understanding what on its own it would deliver. If implemented fully, it would require certain online platforms to implement measures to keep all users as safe as possible from illegal content, and to implement measures to keep children in particular as safe as possible from harmful but not illegal content. It also provides for a whole range of other things, such as pan-EU cooperation between regulatory bodies in each member state, and introduces requirements for online advertising and, for example, influencers. We understand why, when the OSMR was being developed 3 years ago, the Irish government decided to go beyond the AVMS. However, given the rapidly evolving legislative landscape, in particular at an EU level, and the fact that the OSMR has not progressed rapidly, we believe there is an opportunity to ensure alignment with EU developments, which should not be ignored. For the most part, we are supportive of the nature of the regulatory framework that is envisaged. I think most people agree at this point that systemic regulation would be far more effective at delivering societal impact than regulation that focuses on individual pieces of content. We understand that there is a desire among some to include an individual complaints mechanism within the legislation, and we look forward to seeing the report of the expert group in 8 weeks' time. No pressure, Ronan. So to conclude, the current and future legislative landscape for content regulation is complex. The Irish regulatory body, which is to be established under the OSMR bill, is going to be one of a number of very powerful national and global regulatory organisations that will decide on and monitor compliance with the standards which online platforms should adhere to keep their users as safe as possible. As a society, I hope we see the establishment of this regulatory body as only one part of the broader response that is required to effectively address harmful online content. More of the multi-stakeholder approach, which was captured in Ireland's first action plan for online safety, is going to be required if we are to effectively address the issues which the online world presents. We have seen a positive move from the Minister for Education to review the anti-bullying action plan, but perhaps at this point, a revision to the action plan for online safety is required to set out the vision for where Ireland wants to be in relation to online safety in, say, 3 years' time. We look forward to sharing the knowledge and experience that we have built up over the last 15 years in addressing harmful and illegal content with all of the new regulatory bodies when they are established, and working with them to minimise the harms that people encounter online. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much to Ronan, Ioanna, and Dualta for their really excellent and very informative presentations. And so now I